The case for Bitcoin adoption in Palestine. In 1948, war broke out between Jews and Palestinians in Palestine, and by the war's end, some 700,000 Palestinians had either left their homes or were expelled from their homes at gunpoint by Jews. The Jews won the war and forbade the Palestinians from returning, even though 10 to 15,000 Palestinians tried to return to their homes every year for many years and were shot at. Between 3,000 and 5,000 Palestinians were murdered for going home after the war to reclaim their property. Now, if only those Palestinians had had access to a form of digital property they could have taken with them in exile. We'll return to Bitcoin's value proposition as a digital alternative to physical property, but before doing that, first of all, I want to just emphasize how difficult it has been for Palestinians to own physical property in Israel-Palestine. And let's start in 1950 when Israel passed the Absentee Property Law, in which Israel confiscated all of the property of those 700,000 Palestinian refugees, as well as the property of Palestinian internally displaced persons that ended up inside Israel after the war. It came out to something like 4 to as many as 7 million dunams of Palestinian property, 60,000 Palestinian apartments and homes, 11,000 businesses, 6,200 bank accounts, vehicles, tens of thousands of books and manuscripts, crops, equipment, and tons more. Today, Palestinian citizens of Israel are in practice barred from owning 93% of the land of the state of Israel. And this is something the state openly admits, by the way, that it uses the overwhelming majority of state land, and remember, the state owns 93% of the land in Israel, to benefit Jewish Israelis. Now, in addition to all that, Palestinians inside Israel are regularly threatened with expulsion, which would obviously include property confiscation, such as, for example, when the Likud lawmaker Uzi Dayan said after the May 2021 war last year that he threatened the Palestinians with a second Nakba. These are Palestinians inside Israel. But now let's turn to the situation in the occupied territories, where Palestinian property rights are even weaker. So remember, in 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, and over the course of the past 55 years since then, Israel has confiscated over 2 million more dunams of Palestinian property in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They've also demolished tens of thousands of homes across Gaza and the West Bank. They regularly reject the overwhelming majority of building permit applications from the 700,000 Palestinians in Jerusalem and Area C of the West Bank. The situation in Gaza is dramatically worse. Okay, the problem isn't so much lack of property rights, it's the lack of the right to life in the first place. When Benny Gantz was running for prime minister in 2019, he bragged about sending Gaza back to the Stone Age, okay? Those are his words, not mine. The dude was bragging about committing war crimes. 90% of people in Gaza lack access to safe drinking water. The unemployment rate is over 50%. 40% of the population lives in poverty, extreme poverty in most cases. 10 to 20% of children suffer from stunted growth owing to malnutrition, okay? And so, to summarize the situation of the Palestinians as it relates to property rights, it sucks. The Palestinians are in need of a form of property that cannot be confiscated or demolished or made available only to Jews. And so what I want to do now is discuss one such digital property that the Palestinians do have access to. But before getting into the value proposition that Bitcoin offers as a digital property, it's worth pointing out that not all property is equal. As we just saw, property in North Korea or in Chernobyl or in Gaza isn't all that valuable, and that's because property is not intrinsically or universally valuable just because you can live in it, okay? Physical property is of course valuable because you can live in it, but it's also valuable because it's inhabitable and it's in a desirable location and a forgiving tax jurisdiction with strong property laws and a great school district and a million other things that determine the value of a piece of property. And so digital property obviously works similar. There are many factors that determine the value of a digital property. And the most valuable digital properties are incredibly scarce, they're technically sound and secure, and they're universally accessible and desirable. And so you can buy Dogecoin or pets.com or a patent or an NFT in Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse, but not everyone in the world wants to run an online pet supply business or suck Mark Zuckerberg's digital dick face. it's really hard to create a desirable digital property. And that's because property is, by definition, scarce. And digital stuff is, by definition, abundant. And so if you're wondering why and how Bitcoin is the most credibly scarce digital property, and also how and why it's the most technically secure and reliable, and how it's unlikely to get forked or hacked or regulated out of existence, well, you just need to do more homework, because this video is not going to be going into the 101s of Bitcoin and why it's scarce and secure and reliable. But until recently, we haven't had any form of digital property that was permissionless to access, open to anyone in the world with an internet connection, credibly scarce, politically neutral, controlled by no one person, no one company, or no one government, and also very difficult to confiscate. And it almost sounds too good to be true, and in some ways it is too good to be true, because there were 1,000 other attempts to create a form of scarce digital value before Bitcoin came around, and there have been thousands of attempts since Bitcoin came around to create scarce digital value, and all of them have failed to achieve even a fraction of what Bitcoin has achieved. And I do think it's worth speculating for just a moment on why Bitcoin went from $0 to $1 trillion in about a decade, the fastest growing asset in human history. But I do think it's worth speculating here for a minute, because the more the Bitcoin network grew, the more decentralized it became, the harder it became to hack, thus making it even more desirable, attracting more people, which then made the reward for mining Bitcoins even more valuable, bringing in more miners, making the network even more secure, thus making it even more valuable, attracting more demand, and thus creating this virtuous Bitcoin adoption cycle. And by the way, it wasn't always smooth sailing. In 2017, Bitcoin fought a civil war known as the block size wars. Guess who won? Yeah, spoiler alert, it wasn't Bitcoin Cash, okay? It was Bitcoin. And honestly, that's the secret to Bitcoin's success. It's resilience. It's got an army of loyal defenders called cyber hornets, or toxic Bitcoin maximalists, depending on your point of view. And this is the key to really understanding why Bitcoin will continue to grow with or without the Palestinians. I mean, even the founder of Bitcoin, whoever he, she, or they were, had to pay for the electricity to mine Bitcoin in the first place. There was no cheating or stealing. It was just math, science, and the internet. And that's why Bitcoin has grown so fast. It's because of what it represents: freedom and equality. And those values are enforced not by the barrel of the gun, which is the case with every other thing in the world preaching freedom and equality, but it's been enforced by math and science and the internet. And that gave Bitcoin the rocket fuel it needed to become the world's fastest growing religion on planet Earth. And I do really mean religion here, since if you don't realize that Bitcoin is a kind of religion, then it's much harder to understand how and why it has grown so fast. Bitcoin has got a sacred text. It's called the white paper. It's got a mythical creator, a selfless, anonymous, benevolent founder, a community of loyal followers, as we just said, the cypherpunks. It's got markers of belonging like laser eyes. It's got its own colloquialisms like fiat jobs and memes like money printer go burr. It's got consensus rules and failed copycats. Who orange pilled you? And who have you orange pilled? Bitcoin has prophets like Michael Saylor and villains like Jamie Dimon. Bitcoin might not have a lunar calendar, but it does have a 4-year halving cycle, and it may not have 613 commandments, but it is capped at 21 million coins. And if you want to learn more about Bitcoin and what Bitcoin can do for Palestine and the Palestinians, then smash that like button and smash that subscribe button, because we're going to be producing more Bitcoin content and how Bitcoin can relate to the Palestinians and what value it can provide to the Palestinian people. And that is all I've got for you today, folks. But thanks again for tuning in. Until next time.